Hey everyone, welcome to Silence at the Podium, where we unpack the messy intersection of politics, gender, race, and the media. I'm Larissa.
And I'm Mari. Today we're dividing into how the media degrades women in politics and how, by contrast, it sane-washes problematic figures like Donald Trump to preserve dominant power structures.
We're also highlighting two powerhouse women, Jasmine Crockett and Hillary Clinton, and comparing how the media portrays them and why that matters.
So first, let's set the tone with Audre Lorde's iconic essay, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." She basically argues that we can't dismantle systems of oppression using the same structures that uphold them.
Exactly. And when we look at the media, it often uses the master's tools, things like respectability politics, coded language, or who gets airtime, to maintain patriarchy and white supremacy. This shows up clearly when comparing how women politicians are treated versus men. Let's talk about Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She's a Democratic leader from Texas and a civil rights attorney who's quickly becoming a rising star in progressive politics. What makes her stand out isn't just her credentials, it's her boldness, her clarity, and her refusal to be silenced.
She made headlines for fiercely confronting Republican colleagues during a chaotic House Oversight Committee hearing. That was wild.
Yes, so here's what happened. During the hearing, a Republican Congresswoman, Marjorie Taylor Greene, took a low blow at Jasmine by saying, "I think your fake lashes are messing up what you're reading. Like, really? That wasn't just petty, it was sexist, racist, and completely unprofessional."
Ugh, classic.
But Jasmine didn't let it slide. She snapped back with, "I'm just curious, just to better understand your ruling. If someone on this committee then starts talking about somebody's bleach blonde, bad-built butch body, that would not be engaging in personalities, correct?"
Woo, she lit that mic on fire.
And then the internet exploded. People weren't just entertained, they were proud. She was calling out the double standard in real time. Black women are constantly told to stay composed while being disrespected. But Jasmine showed that we don't have to take it quietly.
Right. And instead of being painted as strong or commanding like male politicians are, the media often called her aggressive or too emotional.
Exactly. That's the point. When Jasmine Crockett speaks truth to power with confidence and humor, the media rushes to tone police her. But when men like Donald Trump literally yell insults on national TV, they're called strategic or bold. That's deception.
And that's where Audre Lorde's master's tools really hits, because the media itself is often one of those oppressive tools. They reinforce the same sexist and racist structures by deciding who's allowed to be taken seriously.
Jasmine Crockett is building power outside of that system. She's not waiting for validation. She's showing what real leadership looks like for a new generation, authentic, unapologetic, and unshakably smart.
Hillary Clinton's political journey has been marked by intense media scrutiny, often laced with gender bias. As the first woman to secure a major party's presidential nomination, she faced a barrage of criticism that male counterparts rarely encountered.
For instance, during the 2016 campaign, Clinton's demeanor was frequently dissected. She was labeled untrustworthy and calculating, while her male opponents were praised for being authentic or decisive. The media's focus often shifts from her policies to her appearance and tone, perpetuating stereotypes about female leaders.
Moreover, the coverage of her email controversy overshadowed substantive policy discussions. Analysis revealed that the media dedicated more attention to her emails than to all the policy issues combined in the weeks leading up to the election.
Online platforms showed this bias. A study published in Nature highlighted the surge of different comics directed at Clinton during her campaign, reflecting the larger challenges women face in digital political discourse.
Clinton herself acknowledged these double standards. In interviews, she expressed frustration over the desperate expectations placed on female candidates, noting that traits admired in male politicians were often criticized in women.
This persistent scrutiny underscores the systemic barriers women encounter in politics, where media narratives often reinforce different norms, challenging their legitimacy and authority. This is where Lorde's argument hits hardest. The media doesn't just report, it reinforces. It takes women like Crockett and Clinton and boxes them in, while elevating men like Trump as relatable or strong.
So when Jasmine Crockett refuses to be quiet or compromise her language, she's actually breaking the cycle Lorde warned us about. She's not using the master's tools, she's throwing them back.
Yes, she's resisting the performance of politeness that women, especially Black women, are often forced into. Crockett demands to be heard, not tamed.
And that matters because it expands our idea of what legitimate political power looks and sounds like. It's loud, it's complex, it's female, and it doesn't always smile.
So, final takeaway. The media still struggles to treat women, especially women of color, as legitimate leaders, but Jasmine Crockett and Hillary Clinton show us the power of that persistence.
And Audre Lorde reminds us, change won't come from conforming. It comes from reimagining power outside of the master's house.
Thanks for tuning in and to Silence at the Podium. We're Mari and Larissa. See you next time.
And remember, don't let the media tell you who's worthy. Decide for yourself.
Following the 2024 election results, President Trump and running mate VP J.D. Vance have become notorious for their affinity for AI imagery, truth social tirades, and juvenile Twitter takes.
So let's start with Donald Trump. Since 2016, Donald Trump's behavior has raised countless red flags, whether it be racist rhetoric, erratic tweets at 3 a.m, or unfounded conspiracy theories, an obsession with loyalty, or an apparent disregard for democratic norms. Pundits and political analysts, especially on the right, but even some centrists, have tried to frame this behavior not as dangerous or as delusional, but as calculated, as if every unhinged rant were some sort of strategic move. But we have to ask why. Because Donald Trump holds the position as a wealthy, white, cisgender man, benefiting from what we call sane-washing, which is the presumption of rationality that often shields powerful men from accountability. For example, in the summer of 2020, after George Floyd's murder, Trump tweeted, quote, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." This statement was widely criticized, but also reframed by many outlets and commentators as a strong stance on crime, or, quote, "an appeal to suburban voters." CNN's headline at the time read, quote, "Trump leads into law and order message as unrest continues," end quote. This sane-washing neutralizes the threat behind Donald Trump's language and makes it sound like traditional political strategy, when in reality, women in politics have to conform to strict media scrutiny, while men are allowed to have their erratic behavior corrected by the media.
That is so interesting you say that, Christina. Thanks so much. Honestly, I feel like after researching J.D. Vance, a lot of the brash messaging that both him and Donald Trump use are, as you said, working favorably in the news media, whether it's through sane-washing or their supporters that find it honestly funny and making light of situations. Honestly, during the 2024 election cycle, what I think of as a very key voter issue was abortion, and I think that honestly acted as an ultimate divider between the Harris and Trump campaigns. So when J.D. Vance called abortion exceptions of rape and incest inconvenient, he's staunchly rooted in a nationally illegal system, but according to polling insights, 79% of female Republican voters were in favor of laws protecting patients' access to abortion and pregnancy-related emergencies, and 63 were in favor of a federal law that would grant abortion rights to women in the case of rape or incest. So here we have a really interesting case where Vance's outspoken far-right agenda exercises federal abortion bans, which locks the Trump campaign into a really tight corner of voter support. Obviously, this worked out fine. Both the running mate and Donald Trump are president and VP respectively, but what I wanted to take from this case study is that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are wielding their power as people that are heteronormative, that align with that standard to exacerbate harm onto policies that directly harm those who are marginalized in gender and sex. And I guess talking more about how this brash behavior is perceived online. J.D. Vance called child-free women cat ladies, and he's making fun of women that don't align with the nuclear family structure that much of conservatism and what modern Republicans now think should be the norm. And so I think that takes us into what it means to be a politician and to be a man in this sphere. It just seems like it's not taken seriously, but because of who is saying that messaging, it legitimizes it. What do you think?
I think that's really interesting. A main theme you brought up is taking away from the legitimacy, whether it be from women making their own choices about their family or even just about our government, but having this behavior approved and making it seem rational throughout the media. This really reminds me of in 2018 when Donald Trump sided with Vladimir Putin over U.S. intelligence agencies when there was a concern about Russia meddling in our election. For example, Trump tweeted, "President Putin says it's not Russia, and I don't see any reason why it would be." And this is stunning, and some may say even borderline treasonous. Rather than calling it that, many journalists and politicians called it unusual or wrote it off as saying that Trump was trying to build diplomatic rapport with Putin. CBS even described it as Trump's unorthodox diplomatic approach. Even calling it diplomatic just really makes it seem valid and legitimate. But imagine anyone else contradicting a U.S. intelligence agency and publicly being called a long-term strategist. So I think what's really important is next time we hear someone say, because we will hear the media say this again, he's just being Trump or making it seem rational, we should ask ourselves, why do we let some people get away with chaos by calling it strategy? Because what we want our viewers to recognize is that sane-washing is not about sanity. It's about privilege, perception, and power.
Yeah, totally agree. And now that you say that, it has obviously developed into what Donald Trump is now, which I don't even think he's a president. I think he's almost a deity or a god, where the modern conservative Republican Party worships him to a degree that doesn't stop at being human. It's almost like he is an otherworldly being that demands more than just respect, but almost a sense of worship. And what I think is so interesting in the sane-washing epidemic is that it excuses Donald Trump from a lot of his crazy rhetoric, but it doesn't excuse J.D. Vance. So an example that I think of is, he took the world by storm online during last year's election, but not necessarily in the way he pictured. I don't know if you remember, I'm sure you do, but J.D. Vance rose into the public sphere thanks to a very misinformed but funny tweet about his sexual encounter with a couch. And although this was disproven, the spread and popularity of this tweet bolsters his fame to be this weird running mate second to Donald Trump. And that calls into question why Donald Trump picked him in the first place. So I guess when we're centering this discussion around gender, sex, and power, what I noticed about Vance's public perception isn't necessarily his own gender, sex, and power. It's that he's placed as this weird second to Trump running mate, which I think he's taken under the wings of sane-washing when he's able to say things like, oh, crazy cat ladies are just women that don't get married or have children. I think he's excused from a lot of that rhetoric in the same way Donald Trump is. But where I think it deviates from Donald Trump is his marriage to Usha Vance, who is the child of Indian immigrants. She was under far-right public scrutiny, and there was a lot of not-so-subtle racist jabbing at his personal decisions that deviated from the modern conservative rhetoric. So I think when we question gender, sex, and power in relation to American politics, we have to understand there's a segmentation between normal cisgender white men like J.D. Vance, who are kind of segmented as this weird guy, and this almost godlike structure that Donald Trump has created from 2016 to now. Following the discussion of female politicians with Larissa and Mari, Christina and I are here to bring that into conversation with our respective male politicians, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. So, Christina, what do you have on, just Hillary Clinton, email controversy being so in line with what her brand is and what she's honestly known for in the social media aspect of who Hillary Clinton has become? Whereas, I feel like for Donald Trump, maybe it's because he's done so many things that are arbitrary and odd and don't really make sense, but it's, as we've discussed previously, watered down to sane-washing. I don't really see the same thing for Hillary Clinton, though. What do you think?
Of course, that's a great question, and I'd first like to thank our experts, Larissa and Mari, for really having this discussion and making us familiar so that we can do this side-by-side comparison. From what I've seen about Hillary Clinton, she's always been made out to be this aggressive and shrill woman, so much so that she's not taken seriously. That's what I really take away from these emails. She has a very decorated career in politics, being First Lady, Senator, Secretary of State, and a presidential candidate. Yet, what everyone focuses on is this one mistake with her emails. But what is important to focus on is that we do not apply the same standard to men. As an example, in the 2020 presidential debate, Trump repeatedly interrupted Joe Biden, ignored the moderator, and stirred chaos. acting as if he were a child, some could say. Now, if we were to apply this side by side with Hillary Clinton would have been called aggressive, childish, emotional, these stereotypes that we levy towards women politicians to detract from their legitimacy. However, after this reaction at the 2020 debate with Donald Trump, NBC said Trump's aggressive debate style could appeal to his base, and The Hill reported that Trump disrupts traditional debate format in performance aimed at energizing supporters. By calling it a performance or a strategy, this coverage implies that this behavior was controlled and intentional and strategic. When Hillary Clinton uses her own personal email server, it's trying to say that she's not a qualified politician and that she cannot lead and govern, whereas Donald Trump is portrayed as this strategic politician. And I think this side-by-side portrayal, though not about the same issue, is really interesting for what it suggests about how we are supposed to see the legitimacy of female politicians and why we haven't elected a female president.
Yeah, I think it's great you talk about legitimacy, because the way I see it, because her controversy, I believe, is much more black and white than the emails. That means that she's unjust. She's not fit to be the president because she's, committing these almost atrocities in bringing in her personal life in the public sphere. But what I think the problem is not just that, but that the controversy has been watered down to one word, which is emails. And I think people relegate that into legitimizing why she is not fit to be a politician. They don't know anything beyond the email controversy. They don't know anything about the emails. They don't really know what it entails. But when you really put that into conversation with a lot of the things that Donald Trump has done, it's not viewed in the same way at all. Donald Trump, from, I guess, the leftist standpoint, has been impeached. He engaged in an affair with a sex worker, and those things are a little bit more nuanced, but from my view, it's not weaponized in the same way that Hillary Clinton is to emails as Donald Trump is to affair or impeachment or anything like that. So the discourse of being a woman and having social media against you, I think, exacerbates the problem of misinformation and just lack of understanding in general in politics, which honestly leads us to Jasmine Crockett. And I know Larissa covered this extensively, but Jasmine Crockett's feud with Donald Trump, I think, has a lot to say with the way that especially women of color politicians are placed in inferior positions, not only with somebody that is a higher position of power, who is literally the president of the United States, but is a white man who is an opposing political party that constantly is denigrating her character and her abilities and accomplishments as a politician. I mean, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, of course. I remember when she called, I believe it was Marjorie Taylor Greene, I might quote this incorrectly, but the badly built, bleach blonde butch body, I believe it was, which to some, maybe far on the left, they thought this was funny, portrayed as her just sort of responding to being made fun of in a committee setting. But what we really find is Donald Trump is often given these second chances. He has these emotional outbursts at debates, but we wait for the media to sane-wash this and portray it as appealing to his base to make him seem rational, when Jasmine Crockett was doing arguably a similar thing in this committee setting, but the media calls her emotional. And I think this really ties back to her identity as a woman of color. There's so much scrutiny on women of color in the political sphere because this is a sphere that is built by and for men. Politics really is the ultimate boys' club, so she's already in this space where she is an anomaly in just being herself. Being herself in politics, she's already facing more scrutiny because her identity, people who look like her, are not represented in American politics. So I think we can look at it to say they have different treatment, but we really need to dive deep into the why. And specifically with Jasmine Crockett, I think a lot of it ties back to her identity and that she does not hold a position of privilege. So the media will not lift her up to make her seem rational, but rather make her seem emotional because she's not welcomed, or people who look like her, women of color, are not welcome in politics to begin with.
Yeah, I love that you said that, and I know that Larissa and Mari didn't specifically mention this, but this makes me think of Congresswoman Sarah McBride, who is the first outwardly transgender person elected in Congress. She has been labeled as, quote unquote, the trans congresswoman, and has even gone as far to be misgendered by a lot of her fellow congressmen. And that's not only an attack on transgender rights in the United States in general, but it's an attack on her identity and well-being as a person. And I think to really deduce it down, as you said earlier, when specifically women of color or other marginalized identities are very obviously not welcomed in politics, it becomes this uncovering and almost exposure of how chauvinistic and misogynistic American politics still is at the very foundation of it. Because as you said, we haven't had a female president yet. We tried for 2 election cycles, and sure, there were problems with each campaign, but it really just boils down to identity. And I know that Larissa and Mari talked about Lords and the use of master tools from our course text, but I think of Stuart Hall. Identity is a process. Identity is something that is continuously being formed and created, and I think here is a prime example of how identity is perceived by others, and not only the power to be the one, but the power to make the other feel like otherized. And I think that's exactly what's happening to Jasmine Crockett and Hillary Clinton, maybe in different ways, because Hillary Clinton is a white woman of privilege attached to Bill Clinton, but Sarah McBride as well. Marginalized women who are standing up against misogynistic American politics, but are still relegated to their core identity, even though I think you and I can both agree that bolstering this kind of identity is essential in moving forward with American progression.
Yeah, of course. I think that's really profound. And just next time that we all, as consumers of medias, see portrayals like this, we should ask the question of why. Is it because of identity? You know, as we can, of course, get more white and privileged women in politics, it's not about just having women enter this boys' club. It's about asking these questions about systems of power that keep marginalized identities beyond the gates of privilege of politics. So we really need to be informed consumers of media rather than, you know, being convinced that Donald Trump is rational when he has emotional outbursts. And if we are to believe this, we better apply the same standard to women of color and to female politicians. And I believe that we can really boost their public perception as individuals by being rational consumers of media. So that is the challenge that we impart upon our listeners. And we hope that this has illuminated sane-washing in modern American politics and how we all see this and will continue to see it as the years go on.
Yes, thank you so much, Christina. Thank you so much to the listeners of this podcast. This was the first episode of Silenced at the Podium. Stay tuned for more. Thanks.